But how will the deal impact America's relationship to other powers in the region? And how does it affect Iran's place in the Middle East? Joining me to help answer those questions is Ali Reza Nadir, Senior International Policy Analyst at the RAND Corporation, Emad Kiyaei, Executive Director of the American-Iranian Council, and Patrick Clausen, Director of Research at the Washington Institute of Near East Policy. Thank you all for joining me. Emad, I'm going to start with you. What exactly are Iran's nuclear capabilities right now?
Well, Iran's nuclear capabilities has been actually expanding and accelerating under the comprehensive sanctions that were placed on the country since the initial negotiations broke down in 2005. And Iran has mastered the nuclear fuel cycle. And what that means is that it's able to actually enrich uranium. It's got facilities that have numbers of thousands of centrifuges, stockpiles, and also throughout the country in terms of power plants for medical purposes, and also, of course, also the Arak reactor, which is the sort of the heavy water establishment there that allows it for.
Is that Iran right now?
It is, actually.
I think we have a break in the nuclear deal. He'll take that. I'm going to jump to Patrick really fast. I mean, is there any doubt in the international community that, and from an inspection standpoint, that what Iran's capability is limited to, at this point, to medical and industrial use, that we're not at the centrifuge level that could allow for other things? I mean, part of this deal is premised on the fact that things are going to scale down, not up, but also that they're at a certain place right now.
Well, one of the reasons why I want to have intrusive inspections is because many of the nuclear facilities that we're talking about can be broken down into relatively small parts, and Iran has had clandestine facilities in the past. We want to make sure they don't have clandestine facilities now. So it seems unlikely that they've got a clandestine facility at the moment, but the concern is that going forward, you want to continue to make sure that's the case. So the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, continues to say that it cannot verify that Iran's program has purely peaceful intentions. They have very high standards before they'll make a verification like that, and they have refused to issue a verification like that for Iran. Our hope is that they will be able to do that at some point. The agreement talks about in 8 years, but it's going to take a while.
Absolutely. And Ali Reza, that for us poses somewhat of an anxiety, right? And by us, I just mean anyone interested in Iran not having a weapon. But in general, the sense right now is that medical and industrial use is where they are. Even though the IAEA hasn't averred this, we're fairly certain about that. My question is, what does it mean for them to have enough for medical and industrial purposes? What does that mean?
Well, the goal is to make sure Iran only uses this program for civilian purposes. And looking at the current deal, it looks like it will guarantee that for the next 10 to 15 years, if Iran adheres to the deal and scales back its nuclear program and allows international inspectors to inspect its facilities. So for the next 10 to 15 years, the international community is going to have major oversight over the nuclear program. And even after the 15 years is over, when the deal expires, Iran will be a member of the NPT and will be subject to international sanctions. So I think this is a positive step in ensuring that Iran's nuclear program remains peaceful.
Emad, would you agree with that this is a positive step and that this will actually ensure a peaceful Iran and a peaceful region? I mean, many people argue the opposite, right? That this will only allow them to do what they've always done, which is to surreptitiously develop a nuclear program, to enrich uranium, to move beyond mere civilian capacity. And as a consequence, we'll have a bigger problem on our hands with a much more emboldened Iran.
Actually, this is one of the strongest arms control deals that has ever been done on making sure that non-proliferation is maintained for the Iranian nuclear file. If you look at the text and what has been agreed upon, and as President Obama has mentioned in his own statements early on today and also yesterday, is that all the pathways to a nuclear bomb is being closed off to the Iranians, maybe plutonium, maybe highly enriched uranium, procurement and also covert operations, because what Iran is agreeing to places the most stringent monitoring, verification of its nuclear program, from basically procurement all the way down to when it actually goes into its facilities. So if any fissile material is diverted, we will be, there will be, the international community will find out. And do not forget, the IAEA, the nuclear watchdog for the United Nations, is already on the ground, and Iranian facilities are under 24/7 surveillance. So I think this is actually a push forward for non-proliferation, one. Number two, we can ensure that Iran's nuclear program remains peaceful. And number three, it could actually serve as a model to boost up and beef up non-proliferation mechanisms, not just for Iran, but for the region and beyond.
What do you say to people like Darnell E. in our HuffPost Live community who write in and say almost all of their advances happened under the sanctions regime? In other words, they're saying history suggests that sanctions never stop this stuff from happening.
Definitely. I mean, if you look at, as I mentioned, when the initial negotiations broke down in 2005, Iran had maybe a couple of hundred centrifuges. But following the election of Ahmadinejad in those 8 years and sanctions increasing, it obviously affected Iran's economy and its people. But if the point of the sanctions was to curtail and reduce the ambitions of Iran to develop its nuclear program, well, it failed there, because in that same period of time when we had increasing sanctions, there was an acceleration in number of centrifuges. Iran achieved major stockpiles of highly enriched uranium and expanded its program. So obviously, sanctions were not the answer to curtail Iran's nuclear program. However, we have seen in the past 2 years that Iran has been able to, in these negotiations, come up with really concise and concrete steps to curtail its nuclear program. And that is how we should actually move forward. That negotiations and diplomacy is the path forward, instead of more coercive policies of sanctions and sabotage.
Absolutely. Patrick, one of the contradicting claims made to people who argue that this deal is worthwhile is that we could have gotten a better deal. Not even that. Forget that this is an awful deal. I'm trying to sort of dismiss out of hand the argument that this is just a terrible deal, no good can come from it. But there are some reasonable folk who say this is not the worst deal ever. It's just not the best deal. Even that, what do you say to that?
Well, this is a very complicated deal, and it's going to involve 15 years of squabbling between Iran and the P5+1 countries, because there are so many detailed provisions that there's going to be misunderstandings, disagreements, and I'm not very enthusiastic about the approach that we're taking, which is to try to keep Iran 12 months away from having what's called a breakout capability. That is to say, 12 months away from being able to make the nuclear material for a bomb. I would much rather we'd taken the approach that the UN Security Council had in its resolutions about this matter, which is they said that Iran had to reassure the international community, restore the confidence of the international community about its purely peaceful intentions. Well, Iran refused to do a number of things that the Security Council had said Iran would have to do in order to accomplish that. And so we've compromised, and we've agreed on something which will leave Iran 12 months away from a breakout capability. And that means we're going to be continually involved in monitoring Iran very, very closely and fighting about whether or not Iran's 12 months or 11 months or 13 months. And we've got this 159-page agreement with all kinds of complicated provisions, which most people don't understand yet. I mean, I'm still trying to get my head around this agreement, and I'm amazed people rushing out to say it's a good deal or a bad deal. We have to study this thing and understand.
But couldn't one argue, from the perspective that Iran should have no nuclear capacity, if you're taking that position, one could argue that the fact that they can enrich uranium at all, the fact that they can have any centrifuges at all, is a problem. That medical and industrial programs could be done other ways. You can outsource medical isotopes. You can do other things to make sure you get this.
For instance, the United States does not produce most medical isotopes. We import them.
Yeah.
So we're a pretty big country with a pretty advanced nuclear industry, but we import almost all our medical isotopes. And in fact, many countries around the world do the same thing. Indeed, the Security Council said that Iran should suspend its enrichment until Iran had restored international confidence in the purely peaceful intentions of its program. Well, that's not what we've done. What we've agreed to is something quite different, and it's disappointing we didn't get what the Security Council wanted. This still may be a good deal, maybe the best we could have gotten, but before we decide that, I think we have to look at the deal in great detail. Heck, Secretary Kerry didn't know about some of the provisions of the deal. He was surprised when reporters asked him about why the Quds Force commander, Qasem Soleimani, is one of the people who's going to become free from the nuclear restrictions. And it took a while to realize, oh, well, that's because the UN nuclear restriction is going to go away. So, of course, he, like anybody else subject to them, after 8 years will no longer be subject to them. But I'm just using that as an example to show how complicated this deal is and how we really need to study it before we can decide whether it's a good idea or not. Fair
enough. I mean, Ali Reza, again, there would be some who would argue that if Iran's left with nuclear capability at all, it's a bad deal on its face.
I wouldn't agree. I think overall this is a good deal, and we've known about the parameters of the deal since April when the two sides reached an interim agreement. And when you look at Iran's capabilities, yes, ideally we don't want Iran to have uranium enrichment, but in reality that is not really a choice anymore. Iran has built a vast program. It has indicated time after time that it wants a nuclear program that is peaceful. And according to Iran, that includes uranium enrichment. This was a point of contention between Iran and the P5+1 that was negotiating with Iran for years. And I think to come to a middle ground, you have to make compromises. Patrick said that the United States has made compromises, and that is true. And Iran has made compromises, but essentially this is a negotiation. And not just between Iran and the United States. This is a negotiation between Iran and the international community.
Let's talk about that, Ali Reza.
Council plus Germany. So you have to make these sort of compromises and not really expect a perfect or ideal deal to emerge out of them.
No, absolutely. And you talk about the idea that this isn't just a bilateral kind of talk here. In a new Slate article, Fred Kaplan says, nuclear weaponry is not the greatest fear of those opposing the deal. He writes, what worries Israel, Saudi Arabia, and neocons much more deeply is that Iran might rejoin the community of nations, possibly even as a diplomatic and eventually trading partner of the United States and Europe. Is that really what's at stake here? That people aren't necessarily worried about uranium enrichment. They know that's not going to happen because of the inspections. They're worried that Iran now has a seat at the table, that they've been legitimized.
That is a valid concern. I think Iran's regional policies in the Middle East are a concern for the United States and its allies, Israel and Saudi Arabia, as they should be. And we can't expect one nuclear agreement to transform Iran or change its policies overnight. But I also think this is important because it eases tensions between the United States and Iran. We have the U.S. Secretary of State talking to the Iranian foreign minister on a regular basis. And I think engagement and diplomacy is a U.S. tool that hasn't been used quite a bit when it comes to Iran. And I think now there's some opportunities. Again, ideally, Iran is not going to change its policies in the Middle East. But I think over time, the deal allows some changes in Iran to take place and for Iranian society and even the political system to change over time. And I think that's what's important about the deal.
Emad, would you agree with that assessment here, that this is about the stability of the region, or better put, the understanding of particular nations that this will affect the stability of the region, particularly UAE, particularly Saudi Arabia, particularly Israel, and particularly the United States? To what extent is this really about them having some anxiety about Iran having a seat at the table? And a reasonable question might be, in light of everything that's happening, whether it's what's happening in Yemen in terms of the proxy war, whether it's Iran's stated position toward Israel, although I think it's much more complicated than than Israel would suggest. Is that what this is really ultimately about?
Well, I mean, as you mentioned, I mean, the nuclear negotiations is just one part of a much bigger puzzle in terms of Iran's role, not just in the region, but also opening up to the international community. Yes, there is some concern from these countries that you mentioned which are our traditional allies of the United States, and they see, possibly wrongly, that there is a move towards US-Iran rapprochement, or Iran opening up to the international community, will be at the expense of their strategic relationship with the United States. But the realities on the ground is that the Middle East is in turmoil. And if you look around, actually one of the few countries that is stable, is able to actually assist and be more constructive is Iran. If we keep Iran in the shadows and isolated, they cannot participate in a more engaged and more cooperative way in addressing these regional issues.
But is there a way to bring them to the table? And again, I'm not attempting to paint Iran as this wild card that is somehow outside the sort of logic and practice of other nations. I think every nation has its own interests at heart. I'm just suggesting that right now in the Middle East, given the tension between Saudi and Iran, given the Sunni Shia tensions everywhere that never seem to go away, and given the extreme violence that we're seeing right now in Yemen, I'm wondering if we'll ever see Iran at the table with Saudi. Will we ever really see Syria at the table, with Iraq, et cetera? I mean, it seems to me that we have a very messy circumstance, as you pointed out, and adding Iran to the table doesn't and an emboldened and empowered Iran doesn't necessarily make things better or easier for anyone.
Or maybe not. I mean, let's think about it. I mean, there is precedence for this. I mean, when the United States went into a war in Afghanistan and Iraq, in the aftermath, through Iran's involvement, let's say, in the Bonn conference that created the government in Afghanistan, the key player that brought these parties all together was the Iranians. And this is not from my words. This is from the U.S. administration itself then, and that was Bush era. So the reality is that even in the Yemeni conflict or Iraq or Syria, without Iran at the table, there will not be a comprehensive, sustainable resolution to these conflicts. So I believe by removing the nuclear issue, and we're having a resolution now on it, and let's say if Iran and the P5+1 will deliver on their ends of the bargain, it is a start of a dialogue that can happen within the regional countries. And as President Rouhani has mentioned, this advancement, this breakthrough is now an opening for Iran to engage heavily with the neighboring countries to address these regional challenges that is not just faced by Iran or Saudi Arabia. It really goes into the core of every national interest of the countries in the region and beyond. For example, the fight against Daesh or ISIS. Without the Iranian involvement and Saudi and Turkey and other international community, there cannot be a resolution. So I believe this breakthrough, this nuclear breakthrough, opens up a new chapter for Iran to engage with its regional rivalries and regional countries, and in doing so, address again, not through the barrel of the gun, but through diplomacy, how we can find resolutions to these really challenges that is facing the region.
Absolutely. Now, before you all go, I want to run one more thing by you. President Obama spoke to the New York Times recently, and he identified those in Iran who he believes were against a deal, and he had some words for them. Check this out.
I do believe that there are tensions inside of Iran. What's interesting, if you look at what's happened over the last several months, is the opponents of this deal are the hardliners and those who are most invested in Iran's sponsorship of terrorism, most invested in destabilizing Iran's neighbors, most virulently anti-American and anti-Israeli. And that should tell us something, because those hardliners are invested in a status quo in which Iran is isolated and they are empowered.
Is that a fair assessment of Iran's leadership, Peter? Patrick, excuse me.
Sorry. What Iran is doing in the region disturbs its neighbors. There's no question about that one, because Iran is the principal backer of the Assad regime, which has now killed over 200,000 of its own people and driven 11 million of them from their homes. And that's not a force for stability and progress in the region. The internal dynamic inside Iran is, as in most countries, based on internal politics and not on foreign policy. And so those who are opposed to President Rouhani are going to use any stick they can find to beat him with. And so they're trying to downplay his big accomplishment, the nuclear deal. And they're doing that for domestic political reasons. That's normal in every country. Frankly, one of the reasons why many of the Republicans in Congress are opposing President Obama's deal is because they don't like President Obama. And they would oppose anything which he accomplished.
And there's also sort of reflexive support of Israel as well. And if Netanyahu says this is a bad deal, many people, for the same political reasons, would say we're not going with it because Netanyahu doesn't go with it.
Well, it's an interesting situation when the Saudis and the Israelis are saying the same thing. We don't usually think of the Saudis and the Israelis as being best of buddies. And they're the ones closest to Iran, and they don't like this deal. So it's quite interesting when you have both the Saudis and the Israelis telling you this deal stinks. Then I think anybody should sit up and say, why is it that Iran's neighbors are made uncomfortable by this deal? It may be the best deal that can be gotten. Maybe they're wrong, but at least we should think about what are their objections.
Absolutely, and I think that's why, to your point, we need to read this deal closely. We need to get into the fine print and figure out exactly what's going on here as we watch the negotiations play out both in Iran and the United States, also in Congress as we wait for the response from members of Congress on this deal. Ali Reza, Emad, Patrick, thank you all so much for joining me.
Thank you very much.
Stay with us. Up next, Caroline MT looks at the settlement Eric Garner's family reached with the NYPD. And